San Juan Bosco, born in Italy in 1815, began having vivid dreams at the age of 9, which continued throughout his life. One of his most memorable dreams, and also one of the most terrifying experiences of his life, involved a visit to hell, from which he awoke with burn marks on the palm of his hand after touching the outer wall of hell. The following is the saint's account in his own words. Account of the Vision of Hell by Dom Bosco. I have another dream to tell you, a sort of remnant of those I spoke to you about last Thursday and Friday, which completely exhausted me. Call them dreams or whatever you like. I spent the entire next day worrying about the miserable night that was awaiting me, and when night came, I didn't want to go to bed. So I sat at my desk browsing through books until midnight. The mere thought of having more nightmares scared me. However, with great effort, I finally went to bed. To prevent myself from falling asleep immediately and starting to dream, I placed my pillow upright at the head of the bed and practically sat up. But soon, with my fatigue, I simply fell asleep. Immediately, the same person from the previous night appeared at the foot of my bed. "Get up and follow me," he said. "For the love of God," I protested, "leave me alone." "I am exhausted. I have been tormented by a toothache for several days and need rest. Moreover, nightmares have completely worn me out." I said this because the apparition of this man always means trouble, fatigue, and terror for me. Dom Bosco, listening to confessions. "Get up," he repeated. "You have no time to lose." "Where are you taking me?" I asked. "It doesn't matter, you will see." He took me to an extensive and boundless plain, truly a lifeless desert, without a soul in sight or a tree or a stream. The yellow, dry vegetation increased the desolation. I had no idea where I was or what I should do. For a moment, I lost sight of my guide and feared that I was lost, completely alone. When I finally saw my friend coming towards me, I sighed in relief. "Where am I?" I asked. "Come with me, and you will find out." He went ahead, and I followed in silence. But after a long and sad march, I began to worry if I could cross the vast field, even with my toothache and swollen legs. Suddenly, I saw a road ahead. "Which way are we going now?" I asked my guide. "This way," he replied. "The path of sinners is paved with joined stones, but it leads to the region of the dead, to darkness and to torments." Sirach 21:11. We took the road. It was beautiful, wide, and very paved. Both sides were lined with magnificent green fences, adorned with lovely flowers. Roses, especially, appeared everywhere on the leaves. At first glance, the road was level and comfortable, so I walked without the slightest suspicion. But soon I realized it was imperceptibly sloping downward. Although it wasn't steep, I found myself moving so quickly that I felt I was sliding effortlessly through the air. Truly, I was sliding and barely using my feet. Then I soon realized that the journey back would be very long and arduous. "How should we return to the oratory?" I asked with concern. "Don't worry," he replied. "The Almighty wants you to go. He who leads you will know how to take you back." The road continued to slope downward. As we continued our journey, surrounded by banks of roses and other flowers, I realized that the boys from the oratory and many others I did not know were following me. Somehow, I found myself in the midst of them. As I was looking at them, I noticed that sometimes one, sometimes another would fall to the ground and be instantly dragged by an invisible force towards a terrifying fall, faintly visible, sloping towards a furnace. "The proud have made snares and ropes for me. They have set a net by the path. They have laid traps for me." Psalm 139:6. "What makes these boys fall?" I asked my companion. "Look closer," he replied. I did. The traps were everywhere, some near the ground, others at eye level, but all well hidden. Ignoring their danger, many boys were caught and stumbled. They sprawled on the ground, legs in the air. Then, when they managed to stand up again, they ran with their heads down along the path towards the abyss. Some got stuck by the head, others by the neck, hand, arms, legs, or sides, and were pulled down instantly. The earthly traps, as well as the spider webs and almost invisible ones, seemed very fragile and harmless. Yet, to my surprise, all the boys who were caught fell to the ground. Noticing my astonishment, the guide observed, "Do you know what this is?" "Just a transparent fiber," I replied. "A nothing," he said. "Simply human respect." Seeing that many boys were being caught in these traps, I asked, "Why are so many caught? Who pulls them?" "Come closer and you will see," he told me. I followed his advice, but I saw nothing peculiar. "Look closer," he insisted. I grabbed one of the traps and pulled. I immediately felt some resistance. I pulled harder, only to feel that instead of pulling the thread, I was being pulled downward. I didn't resist and soon found myself in the mouth of a terrifying cavern. I stopped. I didn't want to venture into that deep cavern, and again began to pull the thread towards me. It gave way a bit, but only after a great effort on my part. I continued pulling, and after a long time, an enormous and terrible monster appeared, grabbing a rope to which all these traps were tied. It was he who instantly dragged those who were caught in the traps. "I won't try to compare my strength with his," I spoke to myself. "I will certainly lose. It's better to fight him with the sign of the cross and with small invocations." Then I returned to my guide. "Now you know who he is," he told me. "I certainly know. It's the devil himself." Examining many of the traps closely, I saw that each one bore an inscription: pride, disobedience, envy, sixth commandment, theft, gluttony, sloth, anger, and so on. Stepping back a bit to see which captured the largest number of boys, I discovered that the most dangerous were those of impurity, disobedience, and pride. In fact, these three were linked together. Many other traps also caused great harm, but not as much as the first two. Still observing, I realized that many boys ran faster than others. "Why such haste?" I asked. "Because they are dragged by the trap of human respect." Looking even closer, I saw knives among the traps. A providential hand had placed them there to get rid of them. The larger ones, which symbolized meditation, were for use against the trap of pride. Others, not as large, symbolized well-done spiritual reading. There were also two knives that represented devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, especially through frequent communion and to the Holy Virgin. There was also a hammer that symbolized confession, and other knives that meant devotion to Saint Joseph, Saint Aloysius, and other saints. By these means, few boys managed to free themselves or escape capture. When my guide was satisfied that I had observed everything, he made me proceed along this rose-covered road, but the more we walked, the scarcer the roses became. Long thorns began to appear, and soon the roses no longer appeared. The hedges had been burned by the sun, leafless and thorny. We had already reached a ravine whose steep sides hid what was beyond. The road, still sloping downward, was becoming increasingly steep, excavated and bristling with stones and gravel. I continued, but the further I advanced, the more arduous and steep the descent became, so that I fell and fell several times, prostrate until I caught my breath. Occasionally, my guide would support me or help me get up. Gasping, I said to my guide, "My good friend, my legs won't carry me another step. I just can't continue. Now that we have come so far, do you want me to leave you here?" My guide asked sternly. With that threat, I replied, "How can I survive without your help?" "Then follow me." We continued our descent, the road now becoming so frightfully steep that it was almost impossible to stay upright. And then, at the bottom of this precipice, at the entrance of a dark valley, a huge building appeared, its portal high and firmly locked, facing our road. When I finally reached the bottom, I was suffocated by a stifling heat, while a greasy green smoke, lit by flashes of scarlet flames, rose behind the enormous walls taller than the mountains. "Where are we? What is this?" I asked my guide. "Read the inscription on this gate and you will know." I looked up and read these words: "The place without renunciation." I realized we were at the gate of hell. The guide showed me this horrible place. At regular distances, bronze portals, like the first one, overlooked the descents. Each bore an inscription such as, "Cursed, depart from me to eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels." Matthew 25:41. Suddenly the guide turned to me. Annoyed and frightened, he signaled me to step back. "Look," he said. I looked up frightened and saw someone running along the path at an uncontrollable speed in the distance. I kept my eye on him, trying to identify him, and when he approached, I recognized him as one of my boys. His disheveled hair was partly standing up on his head and partially blown back by the wind. His arms were extended as if he were swimming in an attempt not to drown. He wanted to stop but couldn't. Crossing the protruding stones, he continued falling even faster. "Let's help him! Let's stop him!" I shouted, extending my hands in a vague effort to restrain him. "Leave him alone," the guide replied. "Why? Don't you know how terrible God's vengeance is? Do you think you can contain someone who is fleeing his just wrath?" Meanwhile, the young man had turned his gaze back, trying to see if God's wrath was still pursuing him. In the next moment, he fell to the bottom of the ravine and crashed against the bronze portal, as if he couldn't find a better refuge in his escape. Why was he looking back with so much fear? I asked the guide. Because God's wrath will go through the gates of hell to reach him and torment him, even amidst the fire. When the boy entered the portal, it opened with a roar, and instantly 1,000 internal portals opened with a deafening noise, as if struck by something thrown by an invisible, violent, and irresistible whirlwind. As these bronze doors, one after another, though at a considerable distance from each other, remained momentarily open, I saw something like furnace doors throwing fireballs the moment the young man rushed through. As quickly as they opened, the portals then closed. I tried to note the name of this unfortunate boy, but the guide stopped me. "Wait," he ordered. "Look!" 3 other boys of ours, screaming in terror and with arms extended, were rolling one after the other like massive stones. I recognized them the moment they reached the gates. In that split second they opened, and the other thousands did too. The 3 young men were sucked into that endless corridor amidst a great echo, faded and infernal, and then the portals closed again. At intervals, many other boys fell behind them. I saw an unfortunate boy being pushed down the slope by a companion. Others fell alone or with others, hand in hand or side by side. Each of them carried the name of their sin on their forehead. I kept calling them as they fell, but they did not hear me. Once again, the portals strangely opened and closed with a bang. Then silence. "Bad companions, bad books, and bad habits," said my guide, "are the main reasons why so many are eternally lost." The traps I had seen earlier were indeed dragging the boys to ruin. Seeing so many in perdition, I cried out in despair. If so many of our boys end up like this, we are working in vain. How can we prevent such tragedies? "This is their current state," said my guide, "and that is where they would go if they died now." At that moment, a new group of boys appeared, and the portals opened momentarily. "Let's enter," said the guide. I stepped back in horror. "Come," my guide insisted. "You will learn a lot." We entered the narrow and horrible corridor and passed through it at lightning speed. The threatening inscriptions shone menacingly on all the internal portals. The last one opened to a vast and gloomy courtyard with a large and incredibly threatening entrance at the far end. "From here," he said, "no one will be able to have a useful companion, a comforting friend, a loving heart, a compassionate look, or a benevolent word. All of this is over forever. Do you just want to see, or would you rather experience these things yourself?" "I just want to see," I replied. "Then come with me." My friend dragged me, past through that gate into a corridor whose distant end was at a viewing deck, closed by a huge and unique crystal panel that reached from floor to ceiling. As soon as I crossed its threshold, I felt an indescribable terror and did not dare to take another step. Ahead of me, I could see something like an immense cavern that gradually disappeared into deep recesses down to the bowels of the mountains. Everything was on fire, but it wasn't an earthly fire with leaping flames. The entire cavern, walls, ceiling, floor, iron, stones, wood and coal, everything was a bright white at temperatures of thousands of degrees. However, the fire did not incinerate, did not consume. I simply cannot find words to describe the horror of the cavern. I was looking on in perplexity when a young man appeared running through a gate. Apparently unaware of anything else, he let out a terrifying scream, like someone about to fall into a cauldron of molten bronze, and fell into the center of the cavern. Instantly, he also became incandescent and perfectly immobile, while the echo of his dying lament lingered for another moment. Terribly frightened, I looked at him for a while. He seemed to be one of my boys from the oratory. "Is he not so-and-so?" I asked the guide. "Yes," was the response. "Why is he so quiet, so incandescent?" "You chose to see," he replied. "Be satisfied with that. Just keep watching." When I looked again, another boy entered the cavern at a dizzying speed. He was also from the oratory. More frightened than ever, I asked the guide, "When these boys are running into this cavern, don't they know where they're going?" "They certainly know. They have been warned 1,000 times, but still chose to throw themselves into the fire because they do not detest sin and are too lazy to abandon it. Moreover, they despise and reject God's incessant and merciful invitations to do penance. Thus provoked, divine justice pursues them, and urges them so that they cannot stop until they reach this place. Oh, how miserable these unfortunate boys must feel knowing that they have no hope left," I exclaimed. "If you really want to know their madness and intimate fury, come a little closer," observed my guide. I took a few steps forward and saw that many of these poor, unfortunate souls were furiously beating themselves like mad dogs. Others were scratching their own faces and hands, tearing off their own flesh and throwing it violently. At that moment, the entire ceiling of the cavern became as transparent as crystal and revealed a piece of the sky and its radiant companions safely for all eternity. The poor, miserable ones, furious and panting with envy, burned with rage because they had ridiculed the righteous in life. The wicked will see it and be dismayed. They will gnash their teeth and waste away. The desire of the wicked will perish. Psalm 111:10. "Why do I hear nothing?" I asked the guide. "I come closer," he advised. Pressing my ear against the crystal window, I heard screams and sobs, blasphemies and curses against the saints. It was a tumult of voices and shouts, shrill and confusing. Such are the mournful songs that must echo here for eternity. But their cries, their efforts and their shouts are all in vain. All the strength of misery will come upon them. Job 20:22. Here time no longer exists. Here there is only eternity. And as I saw the condition of many of my boys in full terror, a thought suddenly occurred to me. How can these boys be condemned? I asked. Last night they were still alive at the oratory. The boys you see here, he replied, are all dead to God's grace. If they died now or persisted in their evil ways, they would be condemned. But we are wasting time. Let's continue. He led me, and we passed through a corridor to a lower cavern, at whose entrance I read, "For your worm shall not die, neither shall your fire be quenched." Isaiah 66:24. In this lower cavern, I again saw the boys from the oratory who had fallen into the fire furnace. I approached them and noticed that they were all covered with worms and insects gnawing their vital organs, hearts, eyes, hands, legs, and entire bodies so fiercely that it defies description. Helpless and motionless, they were prey to all kinds of torment. Hoping to be able to speak with them or hear something from them, I got even closer, but no one spoke or looked at me. Then I asked the guide why, and he explained that the condemned are completely deprived of freedom. Each one must fully endure their own punishment, without absolutely any help. Here, one could see how atrocious the remorse of those who had been students in our schools was. What a torment for them to remember every unforgivable sin and its just punishment, the innumerable and even extraordinary means they had to correct their ways, persevere in virtue, and gain paradise, and their lack of response to the many favors promised and granted by the Virgin Mary. What torture for them to think that they could have been saved so easily, but now are irreparably lost, and remember the many good resolutions made and never kept. Hell is truly paved with good intentions. And now, he added, you must also enter that cavern. Oh no, I objected in terror. Before going to hell, someone must be judged. I have not yet been judged, so I will not go to hell. Listen, he said, what do you prefer to do? Visit hell and save your boys, or stay out and leave them in agony? For a moment, I was speechless. Of course, I love my boys and wish to save them all, I replied. But is there no other way? Yes, there is a way, he continued, as long as you do everything you can. I breathed more easily and instantly said, I don't mind staying if I can rescue these beloved children from such torments. Enter here, continued my friend, and see how our good and powerful God lovingly offers 1,000 means to guide your boys to penance and save them from eternal death. Taking my hand, he led me to the cavern. When I entered, I suddenly found myself transported to a magnificent hall whose cut glass doors concealed more entrances. Above one of them, I read this inscription, the 6th commandment. Pointing to it, my guide exclaimed, transgressions of this commandment caused the eternal ruin of many boys. Didn't they go to confession? Yes, they did, but they omitted or insufficiently confessed the sins against the beautiful virtue of purity. Other boys may have fallen into this sin, but in their childishness and shame, they never confessed or did so insufficiently. Others did not genuinely or sincerely regret their determination to avoid it in the future. There were even some who, instead of examining their conscience, spent their time trying to figure out the best way to deceive their confessor. Anyone who dies in this state of mind chooses to be among the condemned, and thus is condemned for all eternity. Only those who die truly repentant will be eternally happy. Now, do you want to see why our merciful God brought you here? He lifted the curtain, and I saw a group of boys from the oratory, all known to me, who were there because of this sin. Among them were some whose conduct seemed to be good. Now you will certainly let me note their names so I can notify them individually, he exclaimed. That won't be necessary. Then what do you suggest I tell them? Always preach against immodesty. Keep in mind that even if you corrected them individually, they would promise, but not always sincerely. For a firm resolution, the grace of God is needed, which will not be denied to your boys if they pray. God manifests his power, especially by being merciful and forgiving. On your part, pray and make sacrifices. As for the boys, let them hear their corrections and consult their consciences. That will tell them what to do. Can I mention all these things to my boys? Yes, you can say whatever you remember. What advice should I give to protect them from such tragedy? Continue telling them that by obeying God, the church, their parents and their superiors, even in small things, they will be saved. Warn them against idleness. Tell them to stay busy at all times so that the devil has no chance to tempt them. The 7 corporal works of mercy, David 10 years the younger, I bowed my head and promised. Weak from the consternation, I could only murmur, "Thank you for being so good to me. Now take me out of here." "All right then, come with me." Encouragingly, he took my hand and lifted me because I could barely manage to do so. Leaving that hall in no time, we returned through the horrible courtyard and the long corridor. But as soon as we passed through the last bronze portal, he turned to me and said, "Now that you have seen what others suffer, you must also experience a touch of hell." "No, no!" I screamed in terror. He insisted, but I continued to refuse. "Don't be afraid," he told me. "Just try. Touch this wall." I couldn't muster enough courage and tried to flee, but he held me back. "Try it," he insisted. Grabbing my arm firmly, he pulled me towards the wall. "Just one touch," he ordered, "so that you can say you saw and touched the walls of eternal suffering, and that you can understand what the last wall must be like if the first one was so unbearable. Look at this wall." I did so attentively. It looked incredibly thick. "There are 1,000 walls between this and the real fire of hell," continued my guide. 1,000 walls surround them, each one 1,000 measures thick and equally distant from one another. Each measure is 1,000 miles. Therefore, this wall is millions and millions of kilometers away from the real fire of hell. It is just a remote edge of hell itself. When he said this, I instinctively stepped back, but he grabbed my hand, opened it, and pressed it against the first of the 1,000 walls. The sensation was so excruciating that I woke up with a scream and found myself sitting on the bed. My hand was burning, and I kept rubbing it to relieve the pain. When I got up this morning, I noticed it was swollen. Having my hand pressed against the wall, even if only in a dream, was so real that later the skin on my palm peeled off. Keep in mind that I tried not to scare you too much, and therefore I did not describe these things with all the horror with which I saw them, and they impressed me. We know that our Lord always portrayed hell in symbols, because if he described it as it really is, we would not have understood it. No mortal can comprehend these things. The Lord knows them, and he reveals them to whom he wills.